Welcome to the Jesus Took Naps podcast, where we learn to embrace the remarkably ordinary life of Jesus on our daily journey. Join us as we talk about life and faith, navigate our own relationships with God, and grow in friendship with each other. We will engage questions about the church and the cultural context of our day as we challenge assumptions and grow in our faith together.
Hello, everybody. This is Victor Scott, and I am here with
Drew Anderson.
And this is Jesus Took Naps. This is a podcast where we talk about the remarkably ordinary life of Jesus.
Yes.
And so we're still practicing our intros. And so be kind. That's all we want. Just be kind to us. Give us pointers. Send us YouTube videos that we can watch, whatever you want to do. But one of the things that we'd like to do is we want to talk about the life of Jesus and how his life as he lived it on the earth can give us insight and direction and wisdom about how we can live a life just like him. And so one of the things that we're going to talk about, of the many things that we're going to talk about, is just how do we deal with our emotions as people? Not only just in life, living life with our families and with our coworkers and with strangers, but as people of faith. What is Jesus teaching us about the emotions that we have, that he has gifted to us? I believe that they're a gift, and we could probably talk about that. Some people probably don't feel that, especially in the world that we find ourselves. But the emotions that we have, how do we deal with them? How do we live with them? How do we use them? How are they a benefit to us? Or how do we need to change our thinking about them? And so, Drew, you and I have had so many conversations about just the way that our emotions can get the better of us and what we do. And I know that you and I have had several conversations about what it is that we can do to become better managers of our emotions. We probably haven't used that language before, but it's a thought that came to my mind. And so when you think about your emotional life and when you think about the emotional life of Jesus, I know that's big, but just kind of how those two things interact in your own thought processes as you've been growing and maturing in your understanding of faith. What kind of comes to mind, and what have you been doing to sharpen your own expression of your emotions?
Yeah. I mean, I think the difficulty for most people is being able to express the emotion that you're feeling to begin with, right? Emotions are sensory things. There's something that's happening in us, and sometimes we don't know how to describe what's happening in us.
It's almost instantaneous.
Yeah, right. So it's all just kind of happening, and it's hard for us to nail it down. And so that's the first thing is learning how to even just talk about your own emotions, right? And identify it, because you may say, oh, this feeling that I'm having right now feels like anger, but it may not actually be anger. It could be something else. It could be disappointment. Could be frustration, right? I can now express the difference between anger and frustration. So learning how to get down to the root of what the emotion is, and then identifying why you're feeling it. Like why do I actually feel this emotion? But
layers upon
layers, but not getting lost in just the emotional world, which we need to go there, but like to not get lost in that, but to also remember that really what this is about is your relationship with God. That whatever is happening in this emotion, whatever is happening in this moment where I feel this overwhelming sense of some sort of emotion, God is there with me. Right. So like God is in this moment with me, with the emotion. And I think that unlocks something for people. It has in my own life, has unlocked something for me that changes the game on the conversation around emotion at all, is when I'm able to be present to God while I'm present to the emotion I'm feeling. It changes how I handle my emotions. So recently, how I've talked about it with some friends of mine is like, if I can hold the emotion in my hand, like if I can hold it out here, if I can, if I have a grasp on what the emotion is, and I can be present to God at the same time, then I'm able to be open-handed with whatever's going on. Then it's not controlling.
All right, I need you to explain that some more, because
yeah.
when you talk about it being open-handed, Are you trying to say that you're kind of visualizing it in a different way as outside of yourself? Are you trying to experience it? I'm not following that.
Okay, yeah, yeah, yeah.
And this is something that's new to me, so I'm definitely interested in how you're doing that. I don't think I have a problem with my emotions necessarily. Like, I don't think I fly off the handle. I tend to be pretty even keeled just in general.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
But that doesn't mean that I'm not prone to have something just excite me, like, either to anger or to, fear or
yeah,
frustration
yeah.
or whatever. But I'm interested in how you're actually describing that. So you're saying you're trying to do these two things at the same
At the same
time.
time. Yeah.
Um, yeah, I'm gonna need some
Yeah.
explaining.
Well, and it doesn't even have to be so I mean, emotions are on a spectrum, right? So it doesn't have to even be the emotions that are expressive emotions. Because sometimes we're
Okay.
feeling an emotion, like depression is not expressive. But I
Mhm.
feel depressed is a state of being. And
Okay.
so being able to to grasp that, I guess you could say, being able to name it, to own it, to say this is what I feel right now. Like there's
Okay.
no way around it. Like this is how I
So an
feel.
acknowledgement that it's
An
present.
acknowledgement that is present,
Okay.
and then the ability to then to get at the why. This is what seems to
Okay.
be causing this feeling. It feels like if you can get there as a person, then you're kind of
Mhm.
holding it. Like it's no longer
Okay.
holding you,
Okay.
you're holding it because you have kind of got a grasp on this is how I feel, this is why I feel that way. And then once I'm there, or even in the process of getting there, it's this continual awareness that God is with me, even
Right.
helping me do that process, right? So I can be in constant conversation with God in that moment. So I want to get super practical on this, right? So when I get frustrated with my one of my sons, so I've got two sons, and if you don't get frustrated with your kids, you're not a human. And so when I get frustrated with my son, one of
Right.
my sons, there's this moment where I can feel the frustration, right? It's there.
Right.
It is present to me. I am present to
It's
it. It
building.
is building. The frustration is there. The moment I'm able to simultaneously acknowledge that God is present in this moment of
Mhm.
frustration and name the frustration, like just
Mhm.
mentally in my head. I don't name it to them. Like one of my sons is
Right.
6 and the other one's almost 3. They there would be nothing worthwhile in me naming it to them. Like me
Okay.
looking at them and saying, I'm frustrated at you would not be helpful at all. But for me to name it in my head, oh, I'm really frustrated with him right now. I I have found that in acknowledging God is there in the moment of frustration, and now I've named it, to me, it has given me the power over the frustration at that point. The frustration does not go away, but now the frustration is useful. Like in
Right.
God's developing of me as a person and how I respond to frustration, it's useful.
Right.
And it's useful in how I'm interacting with my child, because it's not that my child should not sense frustration from me. It's good for a child to know that you're frustrated with them. Like they're going to
Right.
feel it, and that's okay.
That's a social cue
That's
that they need to
right.
learn how to read in other
That's right.
people.
So it's not a bad thing that you're frustrated with them, but it's good for them to then see how you're handling your frustration in a healthy
Yeah.
way, right? And so
Man.
in that moment where I'm frustrated,
Mhm.
my son deserves some sort of a consequence for their behavior, but I'm in control of my frustration. So now I don't have to raise my voice because I'm recognizing that I'm frustrated. So
Yeah.
I can keep myself from raising my voice. I don't have to punish them in a way that's harsher than they deserve to be. I don't have to not punish them because I don't want to deal with it. I can appropriately discipline them, and God is with me in it. So it allows me to then display to them, ultimately display to them God,
Yeah.
because He's the one working through me in that moment. It has taken years just to get
Yeah.
to the point of naming the emotion. And then it took a whole nother set of years over the last couple of years for me to allow God to be present with me in that motion, in that emotion and in that moment. Because I think whether taught or caught in the church, I was given this impression that God did not
Mhm.
want any part of our emotions.
Yeah, I think the idea of suppressing emotion is definitely a cultural
Yeah.
problem where we're no longer, I think I've heard it, and again, if this is a stereotype that doesn't apply, please feel free to correct me, but the idea of the stiff upper lip that you hear that the British people are supposed to have. And I'm like, that just seems to say you need to suppress, bite your tongue, whatever it is that's going on in you. You need to keep that to yourself because that is nobody else's business, or it's something that will expose you in some way that would be inappropriate, or give people advantage over you in some way. And so I think it's interesting that um, the idea of not controlling your emotion, I think that's not the right way of talking about emotions. I think we make a mistake in the church when we talk about controlling. It's about identifying and acknowledging that that is something that's happened. It's interesting that you describe it the way you describe it, is when I can name it, then I can actually deal with it in a proper
Mm.
way. The way that I've always kind of thought about my emotions is that they serve as a warning sign
Mm.
that something has
That's
happened.
right.
It's either something is happening outside of me
Hmm.
and I need to be aware of it,
Hmm.
or something is happening inside of me that I didn't know was there.
Mm.
And I think both of those realities are things that I think we actually confuse those two things, honestly,
Yes,
because we
for sure.
externalize our anger or emotion. I use anger because it's one of the
Anxiety
easiest ones.
it does it, right?
Yes,
Anxiety causes us to externalize like we start making things up as if they're true and they're not because the
right.
anxiety's there, right? And so we're like believing things that are not even true because
So,
yeah,
well, let me say something real quick about that,
yeah,
because anxiety can be a tricky one. Because anxiety, at least in my experience, it's usually been the result of some trauma that creates a responsiveness or reactivity to events. And so I want to acknowledge that up front and say there are probably many cases where it's legitimate.
yes,
But at the same time, we confuse that feeling
yes,
with a permanence that
yes,
probably should not
yeah,
exist. And so I want to say that that is probably a more healthy way of acknowledging that. And I'm not saying you weren't doing that. I'm just
yeah,
saying
yeah, yeah,
I heard it and I wanted to speak
yeah,
to it.
for sure.
And so the emotion issue, I think where the church has kind of gone wrong, and we need to address this because it's something important.
Mhm.
And I know I've felt it in my own life, and maybe some of you who are here with us have felt it as well, is that the church tends to look at emotions, at least in the last 20 years or so, in my experience as a pastor, has been, if you're having an emotional reaction, it means that there's something wrong with you.
Mm.
And I don't think that's true,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
The reason I feel that emotions are like a warning sign is because it's something that we have instinctively, right? I am not a fan of horror movies. I'm not a fan of fun
yeah, I'm
houses
not either.
because I do not like being
Yeah,
startled, right?
yeah,
I do not like my heart rate to be jacked up that
yeah,
way. Like if I want to get my heart rate up, I need to do
yeah,
exercise. I don't need to do it that way. I don't like roller coasters, right? Like that is just not the way I want to be, stimulating my mind or my life. But that is a kind of artificial way of stimulating emotion. And what happens, I think, is that it becomes an adrenaline rush in a way. In some cases where we look for that, right? The people who are those adrenaline junkies who are jumping out of planes. Hey, if you do that, God bless you, right? I'm not saying that's just not my
yeah,
thing.
yeah,
Um, but at the same time, our emotions are there, right? God gave them. I love the way you said that thing. We want God present. God gave them to
yeah,
us. Let's just start with that.
yeah.
Let's just start with the fact that you were created to have these
That's right,
emotions. And we see that perfectly illustrated in Jesus'
for
own life.
sure.
Jesus had emotional reactions, and you could almost say outbursts
Yes,
in the
yeah,
scripture, recorded in the Bible,
that's right.
recorded in the Bible. And we don't look at Jesus' life for clues. How do we actually deal with these moments, right? We have an instance of him turning over
Yeah,
tables,
anger.
right? And people immediately turn to, well, he was just doing stuff to religious people. Okay, let's not even get to that yet.
Yeah,
Whatever he saw made him
that's
angry
right.
enough that he was throwing people's money on the ground, flipping over tables, and he grabbed a whip and started whipping people, grown people.
Yeah, I mean that's pretty
Like
serious.
I just can't imagine. I can't imagine that scene.
Yeah,
I just can't imagine that scene. But that is Jesus doing that, and he was angry, and yet in his anger,
he did not sin.
he did not sin. What do you make of that, Drew? Because I think of that story and I'm just blown
Yeah,
away by that. And I know I've heard a lot of people, and I may be guilty of this, who have thrown that out there, and it's been manipulative
yeah, yeah,
using
yeah,
that
yeah,
language. It's been
yeah.
manipulative. And so here's this emotion that people have that God gave to them
Anger.
to be used in a good
Hmm.
way, right? For their benefit,
Hmm.
and maybe even for the benefit of those around
Hmm.
them. And yet it's been used against them
Yeah,
to try to control them. And I
yeah,
think and that might be oops, I hit my mic. That might be a conversation for another day. But the issue of Jesus' own expression of emotion,
Yeah.
right? We picked the anger one because it's kind of the one that just jumps up at
Yeah.
us. But there are other expressions of Jesus'
Yeah,
emotion.
where he weeps over the death of Lazarus, and over the grief of Lazarus' family and friends. So it's a combination of all of it, I believe, is why he's weeping. But he weeps. He absolutely weeps, cries, is overcome with emotion. I think there's a variety of reasons why people struggle with Jesus and his expressions of emotions. One, I think it's because a lot of people struggle with their own expressions of emotion.
Guilty.
I,
I'll join that group.
I think because we struggle with just our own ability to
Yeah.
express emotions appropriately and talk about them and work through them and allow God to be present in them, then we don't like talking about Jesus and his expressions of emotions. Or
Right.
the reverse side of that is then people can use Jesus's expression of emotion to justify their own version of expressing that emotion, right?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of ways people can not really want to deal with Jesus's expression of emotion and the way he does it in a healthy way. I I think what Jesus shows us, one, those are not the majority of the stories. I think that's always important to point out. He only flips tables once. We only get Jesus wept once. It's not that he didn't feel anger any other time. It's not that he didn't feel grief any other
Right.
time. Those are the only stories
Right.
we get, though, and they're in the minority of the stories of when he expresses emotion to that degree. I think that
Right.
correctly places emotion in people's lives. We're not all the time weeping. If someone is weeping all the time, if they're weeping every single week at church, there's something wrong. There just is. There is. If you're experiencing the same emotion to the highest degree on a consistent basis, you're either faking it or there's an imbalance going on. Like you've got some stuff going on that you're going to have to deal with. The same would be true of depression, but the same would be true in some sort of seeking of excitement, right? Thrill seeking.
Right.
It's something
Yeah.
is off if I'm constantly putting my life on the line for a thrill.
Yeah, those kinds of peaks can be dangerous.
That's right.
And it doesn't matter the
It
emotion.
doesn't matter which way the peak goes, but
Those kinds of peaks can be
so
bad
that
for
displays that for us that Jesus, it's not that he didn't feel the emotions, but he didn't
you.
always express them in some sort of a peak way, some sort of a way that was seen
Yeah.
and overt. But it also teaches us that God himself feels deeply emotionally. Like that's a way we were created in the image of God. Is that these emotions are of God. They were created into us as a part of who he is. And I think what that should do is liberate us. It should give us freedom to feel the emotion without feeling bad for feeling the emotion.
I don't know if people can do that because, let me qualify, because we struggle with dealing with the perception, right? We have this bad habit, I know I do, of externalizing, well, not externalizing, that's the right way. I keep worrying, another emotion, about what other people think about my emotions, right? And so, and the thing is, we want to talk about the ideal, right? We want to talk about where we're kind of resetting our faith understanding too, right? That's kind of the idea. Jesus lived an ordinary life, right? We keep saying a remarkably ordinary life. That's the tagline of the podcast. It's one of the things that's really motivated us to even do this and to have these kinds of conversations. But for us, I think, and for me, I'll just speak for myself. I don't want to, blame anybody else. I think my point of struggle with the emotions thing is worrying what someone else is going to say if I really kind of experience that emotion, right? And being in the position that I'm in as a pastor, it can be challenging at times to be honest in public.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I can come home and I can, listen to the message from Sunday. I can listen to worship music. I'm going to adjust myself in my chair real quick. And I can be, because I'm by myself, right? I'm in the safety of my home. But it's difficult at times to find people that you can be that honest with, where they can just receive you in the midst of whatever the struggle might be. And I think that's the challenge, right? I'll just to be a little bit transparent, I think it's one of the things I've appreciated in our friendship is the way that I can just, share with you, things because of the trust that we've developed over the last few years. I can share with you, some of the things that I find funny that I probably can't share with other
Yeah.
people. And it's not that it's inappropriate, and for whoever might be wondering, what is he sharing with Drew that he can't share with it? It's not that. It's just that there's a humor in that thing, or there's a sadness in that thing, or there's an anger that is created by that thing that I can't share that with everybody because not everyone would understand kind of where my heart
Hmm.
is. They wouldn't know, what I'm trying to find out in that. There's a few people I can do that with. I can do it with my wife. I can do it with my dad. I can do it with you, and I've got a couple other friends that I can do that with. Um, but it's not many people. It's not many people who would understand. And I think if I would give anybody any advice is you need to pick who you can be honest with, but you need to you need to have those people in your life that you can be emotionally raw with.
Yeah.
Because if you don't have that, you will go nuts.
Yeah.
Like I just believe that is not the way we should
Yeah.
operate. And I may be wrong, and I'm more than happy to be corrected on that.
No, I
But
think we do need a safe relationships where we can just express emotions openly and honestly, sometimes even express them wrongly, where someone's going to have the grace to help us navigate those things. A
man, I
thousand,
love that. Express it
a
wrongly.
thousand percent. Yeah.
I love that.
Well, I mean, you've got to. I mean, kids don't learn to walk by perfectly the first time, right? They
Yeah.
fall, they stumble, they hit their head. The parent is there to help them get back up and keep trying. And so we do need those relationships. Sometimes those are relationships where, we go see a counselor, a spiritual director. Some of them are friends, some of them are family. Wherever those trusted relationships are, we need those. However, I do want to say we can't only express our strongest emotions in those settings. We do have to learn how to express those strong
Mhm.
emotions out in public as well. Because I think that's, in my estimate, where the church has failed the culture the most on this issue, is that we have not rightly expressed these emotions in public well. And so
Right.
who's leading the conversation on these emotions are people who aren't expressing them in a way God would want them to be expressed.
Yeah.
Because they're just
using them as
they're
weapons.
just using them as weapons, right? So
Yeah, they're using them as weapons.
they're just wielding emotion any
Yeah.
way they want to because they don't have a barometer on it anyways. They don't have a relationship with the one they created them. They don't have God present with them in the emotion. And so then they're just wielding it, expressing it willy-nilly. It's out there. And so anger becomes an outburst. And
Let me ask you a question
yeah,
real quick, because I'm sorry to interrupt,
No.
but I need to ask you this question
Yeah.
now before I lose it. Why do you think when people are dealing with their emotions, why do you think people see the emotion as a true expression of the situation that they're in? Right? Does that make sense? Like, I think most of the time in emotion, you use your example with your son, you get frustrated. You got frustrated because something was happening with what they were
Yeah.
doing. And it was something that you as a parent, you knew it wasn't
Yeah.
right. But you also recognize that the reason they were doing it is because they don't know something. There's something missing in their knowledge. And that missing knowledge could cause harm if it's not corrected. And that could create the frustration. So we seem to be living in a moment in time in this culture, and right now we're living in the American culture, where the emotional reaction that we're having to the events, circumstances, and situations that we find ourselves in is perceived as a true representation of what happened, rather than an identifier that something happened that needs to be addressed. And I think there's a difference between those two things. Does that make sense to you, what I'm asking?
Yeah, no, it does make sense. I mean, I
Okay.
don't think it's unique to our culture.
Well, no, but this is where we're living,
No, I
and so
know.
I'm just kind of
I'm just trying to
speaking to
I'm
that.
just trying to think back on Jesus's life and his interaction. I don't think it's unique to our culture. I mean, you get this moment with Jesus where the Pharisees are angry and they're coming at him in anger, and his reaction to them is to not escalate the situation, though I have no doubt he would have been frustrated with them in that moment.
Yeah.
He expresses in a very even-handed sort of way his response to them. And so but then you get Jesus expressing his anger in other places. You get Jesus confronting the Pharisees in other
Mhm.
places. Woe to you, right?
Yeah.
The woe statements are pretty confrontational. It's not that anger was never the correct response towards the Pharisees or Sadducees or law keepers, whatever, that
Yeah.
were constantly trying to trap him. It just wasn't always the correct response. And so I think the dilemma for us in the culture that we're in, when we're dealing with a culture that's teaching people that whatever your emotional response to something is the truth of that situation, is that it's causing them to be limited in their perspective of what is actually happening in them and in the world.
Yeah.
And I think what a relationship with Jesus is supposed to do, what a relationship with God is supposed to do, is to allow you to interact with the situation, but not be controlled by it all at the same time. So a
Yeah.
relationship with God puts you fully present in the situation you're in, and yet completely aware that this situation is not determinative. It's not determining the entirety of what's happening in my life or in the world all at the same time. And Jesus is like this podcast, the title is the perfect example of that. Jesus is taking a
Yeah.
nap in the midst of a storm. He's not taking a nap to ignore what's going on around him. It's that
Right.
what's going on around him is not determinative of all of what's going to happen, right? He has an understanding that in each moment he's in, those moments are not the most important thing. That moment will pass. There will be another
Yeah.
moment. There will be another circumstance. There will be another situation that comes. And so why am I going to treat this moment as if it is more important than the other moments that are to come? And I think that's where people get hung up. They experience something, they have some sort of an emotional reaction to that thing, and they're not able to see that thing as a part of other things. They isolate it. They isolate an incident, and by isolating the incident, it distorts the incident itself.
So they isolate it, and then they generalize it by saying that every time this happens, it's going to have I should have the exact same response to it, rather than realizing that that's not the way it should be.
That's not the way it ever is.
Because we change. I think that's the other thing. If we're not growing in our understanding of how we're responding to things, even if it's not an emotional response, just a response. How many of us, right? I know I've had this hundreds, if not thousands of times. How many of us, 5 hours after a conversation, like, that's what I should have said.
Yeah.
I should have done that, or
and
I should have said it this way.
Maybe you get better at saying it in the future.
Correct, because then you rehearse it.
This is a great example.
I want to be ready.
A great example of this. I had a friend of mine who I'm discipling, mentoring, call me this last week, and he wanted to thank me for how I spoke about a situation that's going on in the world, specifically related around race. There's some racial tension going on in this small town that he's doing ministry and living in with his family, and I there's tension going on, and I was able to bring the perspective of the person who's causing the tension. I was able to say, this might be why they're doing this. Like you've got to see this from their perspective. This might be why they're doing it. This might be the motivation behind the reason they're causing tension. And it might actually be a good thing when it's all said and done, but you've got to be able to see it from that side. You've got to be able to interact with this person and understand why they're behaving the way they're behaving. And he wanted to call me and thank me for that, because he said, hey, I still, when I get into a situation like that, where that person is causing tension, I still am having like negative thoughts about them in that moment. But do you think I'll ever get to the point where I can interact with them the way you're interacting with them? And I said, yes. Like, I didn't get here overnight. Do you not think I was in the same place you were years ago? Like, yes, of course I was.
Yeah.
Early on, I would have reacted to them. They would have caused tension. I would have matched it, right?
That's
right. Then at some point, I learned to just keep it to myself. I still felt it, but I kept it to myself. I was able to manage it. And now, over time, God has transformed me to the point where now they're causing the tension. I'm just loving them back. Like I'm going, oh yeah, yep, here we are again. And that's okay, because I understand why you're doing this. And
Right. You don't see your emotional reaction to their emotional reaction as needing to create
that's
conflict.
right. And
And that listen, let me tell you something. That is one of the hardest
it's so
things to
hard.
do, especially when you're dealing with personality
It's so
conflicts,
hard.
when you're dealing with high tension situations, especially with some of the stuff revolving, like you mentioned, the race
Yeah.
stuff, the racial issues that we have been dealing
I don't
with in
want to
the last few
minimize it,
years.
how hard it is at all. I mean,
No, no, no. I know you, but
at
I
all.
was just like pointing
Oh, it's
out.
so hard.
I can imagine. Um, it is difficult because here's the thing: we're not saying, again, going back to what I said earlier, we're not saying suppress this stuff.
No.
We have to learn to control
Yes.
it, right? To recognize that. I guess a different way of
I
thinking
don't
about it
want to
is this, and
say
this is me.
control, because earlier you even said control is a negative way to talk about it,
Yeah,
because I think it is. I kind of like the
we need to
language
manage it. I guess probably
managing
a
or
better way.
harnessing.
Yeah,
I like the idea of harnessing. It's used a lot in like sports circles, especially like you got to
yeah.
harness your energy,
Focus it. You got
focus
to
it.
focus it.
Yeah.
You got to
Yeah.
focus
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
But what I was saying is like the challenge with our emotional reactions, responses to things, is if those are the things leading us, right?
Yes.
Because here's the thing: in my
Yes.
own life, whenever I've had an emotional reaction that was unexpected, and by unexpected means it's something new that I didn't know how to respond to it, and that causes me to be even more
Yeah.
flustered. What that did was it short circuited my ability to think. Right? It kept me from being able to think clearly and to respond in a way that was appropriate to the situation. And right, and that's where remorse comes in and regret comes in, is because we respond in ways that we know are inconsistent with who we want to be as believers. Right? Again, not minimizing or saying that sometimes a strong emotional response should be given. That's not what we're saying,
No,
right?
not at all.
But that in all of that, going back to something you said at the beginning, because I think it was so good, being able to hold the emotion and know at the same time that God is present, working in,
Yes.
around, and through you,
Yes.
both of those things at the same time, that requires a level of awareness and discipline that our culture is not
No,
encouraging.
that's
I
right.
think that's where I'm at with this,
Yes.
is that we should not feel, ironically, we should not feel that we can just unleash our emotions on people,
Yes.
right? That kind of quote unquote freedom is very unhealthy,
No.
both to
So
you as an
hurtful.
individual, to
That's
me,
right.
and the people
That's
around me.
right.
And so I think that's one of the things, is that in Jesus, right? The going back to that statement, he was angry, but he did not sin. I think what that's pointing to, and I'm gonna share with y'all listening, with Drew. This is a new thought for me. This is new. I'm gonna try to articulate as best I can. In that statement, what we are saying, what we should be seeing, I think, is that there is a way to express the fullness of an emotion without causing an emotional harm to the person on the other side. I have no idea how that actually works, but I think that's the direction that we should be going
And I
in.
think God can do
That
it.
I can be fully
That's
emotional,
right.
fully in that
And
moment
fully.
without causing harm to the other
That's right.
person.
No,
Wow. I
I,
mean,
I,
that's
I
wild.
think
That's crazy.
I think that is the essence of transformation in the life of the believer. I mean, I think our ability to recognize that it's not suppressing the emotion that solves the problem, but it's God being present with us in the emotion that solves the problem
Yeah.
would be transformative to so many people, because so many people have been taught to suppress emotion, or
Hmm.
to, like you said, express it just openly to anyone at all times, and it becomes almost like a weapon, and
Unfiltered. Yeah.
unfiltered. And both of those are not helpful to people. That not everyone deserves to have unfiltered emotion poured out at them all the time, and you shouldn't suppress it. Both of those are extremes that are unhelpful. The ability to fully feel the emotion and fully feel God present with you in it is the height of relationship with God within this human body. And the idea
Yeah.
that emotions are not trustworthy, like imposing things on emotions that they were never meant, burdens they were never meant to bear, imposing things on them that they were never meant to solve,
Hmm.
it has caused us so many problems because people have pitted emotions and thoughts against one another, right? That you see this all the time. Well,
Right.
they're an emotional person. Oh, because you're not. Everyone's emotional. Like
Correct.
you're pretending as if you don't feel emotions. What you're
Yeah.
trying to say is they're letting their emotions lead them. Okay,
Hmm.
well, you're letting your intellect lead you. Which one's better? I don't know. I don't know that either's better. I know a lot of intellectual people that get led in the wrong
Yeah.
direction. So
Even that framing is
that's
bad.
right. Just
It's not better or worse.
that's
It's
true.
it's
That's right.
real. It's a part of who we
It
are
just is what it
as
is.
people.
And if we're able to say, "Hey, I had this thought," the scripture talks about taking every thought captive, right? So
Right.
my thoughts shouldn't lead me either. The spirit should lead me. My relationship with God should lead me. When I have a thought, God needs to be present with me in the thought. When I have an emotion,
Yeah.
God needs to be present with me in the emotion. And God will lead me in my thoughts and my emotions at that point. Like that's the problem is we're pitting these things against each other. We're trying to pretend like one's better than another. And all we're seeing in the current generation is an overcorrection. You and I have talked about this a lot, and I'm sure we'll do a whole episode on overcorrection at some point.
Mm.
But we're just seeing an overcorrection of the hyper
Yeah.
intellectualism that used to lead the
Right.
way, suppress emotions, be intellectual. Now we're just seeing an overcorrection. No, let's embrace emotions fully. Well, yeah, let's not ignore them, but they're also not our God any more than intellectualism is our God. Reason isn't my God either. God is my God.
Well,
Like
I think it's a misunderstanding of the divine image in
it
us.
is.
It's a fundamental misunderstanding of the divine image because we are an integrated
That's
whole,
right.
right? That we now sure there are people who lean in one direction or another. Some people might be more emotionally inclined, other people more intellectually inclined. But the thing is that even the most intellectual person has emotional
Yes.
reactions.
Well,
It doesn't matter if it's very muted, they still have emotional reactions. And if they don't have those controlled, I hate the word control, I said it again, but if they don't know how to integrate that into their
that's
life
right.
in a healthy
That's
way,
right.
then what's going to end up happening is that they're not going to know what to do when that emotional reaction happens. Which is why the idea, and I don't even know where I came from. I'm gonna have to find out if I can remember, but the idea of them serving kind of as warnings, right? Whenever you reaching the edge of something, lights goes off, or like for the cars that have the beep when you back up, like beep 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 beep, beep yeah,
Yeah,
stop, you're
yeah.
gonna hit them, right? That whole thing. That's the idea. The idea of our emotions for me is it's a warning, right? Our mind cannot process what the emotion does. The emotion cannot be controlled. It is what happens because our body, our mind, our spirit, whatever it is triggered by that
Yeah.
quickly. Okay, I have to deal with this now. It gives me the split second I need to know something's up, to know something's
Yeah,
wrong.
and it doesn't have
And
to
I think
be.
that's the
I
challenge.
agree on the warning language when we're talking about certain emotions, but I mean some emotions are really positive emotions. They're not necessarily a
Yeah,
warning, but it is some sort of
it's an
an
alert. Maybe a
alert.
warning.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
It's an
Yeah.
alert to something that's
It's
going
an
on
alert
there.
to something that's going on there. So like I think that that's a positive way to talk about it. That it allows you to understand, hey, there is something happening here and I need to be aware of it. That if people would practice this, if I would learn to integrate this more into my life, if all of us would learn to integrate this idea that I can hold my emotion here and allow myself to be fully present to God and God to be fully present to me in it, then we would have so much more healthy reactions to people all the time. And we
Yeah,
would find ourselves getting less trapped in these emotional cycles of conflict with people too that happen constantly in people's
yeah,
lives. Most conflict are just cyclical things in people's lives, and it's because that person, even if they don't express the emotion, we feel it on them and then we respond out of our own emotions. And then it just
yeah.
creates this cycle over and over again. That's not new. It's not even a new concept in the counseling world because it's just what we do as humans. And so that's why if we're able to not suppress it and not worship it, right?
Yeah.
It is not our God and we are not meant to ignore it, but we are just meant to say, hey, I'm a human. I have emotions. Here's the emotion. Okay, what do I do with this? Then we will
So what
begin to
would you
express
say?
it in healthy ways.
Yeah, I agree. So what would you say to people who on either side, right? There's people who just tend to be less inclined to express their emotions. They lean into the suppression issue,
Yep.
right? They're going to keep it bottled
Yep.
up. Or the person who is more freewheeling with their emotional
Yep.
expression, right? What are some things that you would suggest? Because I really liked your idea, so I think I'm going to let you kind of give us some practical tips for today, because
Yeah.
I'm interested to see how you would frame this or talk about it. What are some things that you would do for someone who has never done what you're doing, what you're describing, this idea of holding it in one hand? What are some practical things, maybe just one thing that they can do to be more aware in those moments that they can begin to practice? Because I know for me, um, it can be difficult when if it's an emotion I've had before,
Mm-hmm.
I feel like I've learned to be present and aware. But when it's a new emotion or a more intense emotion, um, that's where I'm like, what do I need to do? What is a kind of that practical thing that you would say
Yeah.
that's been helpful to you?
Yeah. For me, the most practical thing I can say, and it sounds so, it's so, I don't, it almost just sounds weird and stupid, but it's been really practical, is to be present to my physical body and my breathing.
Okay.
And there's a long-standing practice in the church of breath prayers. And breath prayers are partially about the words you're saying, but mostly they're about being present in your body, like just reminding yourself you're in your body. Because this sounds so crazy, but emotions, when you're overly emotional or you're suppressing emotion, you're not present to whatever's going on. You're not actually present to the moment. Your emotion is either projecting on other people or you're suppressing and you're trying to just hide. You're not actually present in the moment. And when you can force yourself to, like, okay, I'm here, I'm present, I'm in the moment with whoever I'm with in that moment,
Mm-hmm.
or just to the moment itself, then it gives me the opportunity to hopefully stay calm enough to name the emotion. But if
Okay.
I'm not
Give me an example how you do it.
present to it. So
Yeah, let's right
yeah,
here. How would you do it?
yeah. So if in this moment you said something that like made me angry, right?
Drew, you're a
Yeah.
jerk.
Except you just made me laugh. But if you said something that made me angry, you shared a story with me where I was going to get
Mm-hmm.
angry about that thing, then I would
Mm-hmm.
be able to, in that moment, just kind of take a deep breath, remind myself that, hey, God is in control. God is here. I may say a breath prayer. I may say, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God. But it's this breathing that in that moment I go, okay, now this emotion I'm feeling, what is it? Like in my brain, I'm able to do that in that moment because I have
Mm-hmm.
made myself present to what I'm feeling.
Mm.
Instead of feeling the emotion and wanting to suppress or run or not deal with it, or just expressing it, hey, I'm angry. I use my breath, this thing that God gave me, that He literally
Mm-hmm.
breathed into us, that I think does have these incredibly spiritual, powerful things connected to it, because it's the very word in Scripture for the Spirit of God. It centers me. It allows me to be present to the emotion that I'm feeling. And I didn't make this practice up. I mean, this is something that people have been doing for a long time, and you hear it taught in non-Christian circles around breathing and counting to 10 and stuff like that. Like, none of it is distinctly Christian, and yet, in my opinion, it should be distinctly Christian. Like, we should be the ones leading the way and teaching people to be present to their emotions through the use of their own breath, through the use
Right.
of their own pausing.
Well, it's not distinctly Christian, but it's particularly human,
Yes,
and that's why it's
of utmost
common in so many
importance
different traditions. Yeah.
to our relationship with God too,
Yeah.
because it's how He created us. And and so for either person, for someone who feels an emotion and wants to run from the emotion, the ability to breathe and then name the emotion, either in their head or
Mm-hmm.
verbally, and then for someone else who wants to express emotions right away, your ability to breathe and then name your emotion,
Yeah.
and then eventually practice God is with me in this emotion too is going to bring you freedom in so many ways. And I know that there's probably someone with some sort of psychology degree that's going to disagree, but I've just
We would love to know
we
why.
would love to know why, but I've
Yeah.
just seen it at work in my own life and at work in the people that I have been in spiritual direction with and have counseled through pastoral ministry for a long time. I've just seen it work. And
Well, I think the idea of prayer is that it slows us down by bringing us by making us think about something that we cannot not think about, right? Most of the time we don't think about our breathing, but by making that the focus, right, of that moment, I think, you know, this is not like the same thing. It's not super spiritual, but like went golfing with my dad and some friends the other day, and I knew that I was swinging way too hard. And so before I would take a swing again, I would take a deep breath in and take a breath out. And then I would swing, and I found myself just relaxing and being less tense and all this kind of stuff. And it's like I was doing it for a completely like non-spiritual thing, but that
same
just that
principle,
split
same
second
principle.
of being aware, right? That's why I'm bringing it up, because
That's
it just came to my mind. That split second of awareness of where I am and what I'm trying to do brought so much clarity. And I think that's part of the challenge. And I love that practical idea, because when we have an emotional reaction to something, something triggers an emotional response in us, one of the first things that we stop thinking about is this idea of our breath. And by saying, no, that's going to be the first thing I think about, then all of a sudden our mind can catch up to the emotion.
And especially if you integrate prayer with it.
Yeah.
Breath in and of itself deals with the image of God in us, because God breathed into humanity. That's we just know this to be true. The Spirit, how the scriptures talk about the Spirit in both the Old Testament and the New Testament, are the words for breath, the breath of life, the wind, the breath of all existence, of all creation. There is something just inherently spiritual about our very breath. And so if we will allow ourselves to be focused on this breath that God has given me, and in that moment then acknowledge his presence with us, I truly believe it is a God created way. I just think it's how he's created us, and it allows us to, in that moment, understand our emotions in their place.
Well, the way that it's the fact that it's so common in the human experience is evidence to me that this is something that God has given to us, that we haven't properly learned how to use as a technique, as a tool, as a practice. And so I think one of the things that we're going to do is we're going to maybe put in the description a short kind of just step-by-step thing that you can do, and have the words of a breath prayer. Because we want you to use these things. Not only do we want to share some thoughts and ideas with you, but we want to provide some practical resources that you can use as you go through your life. And so, I just wanted to ask you, because I know that through your training in spiritual direction and some of the other things that you've been doing, that you've been using some of these things, and I just wanted to hear a little bit more more from you. But
for sure, and it's a topic I love to talk about, mostly because it was something that was ignored in a lot of my spiritual upbringing. It was just not something that was talked about a lot. Most of the time, it was as if we wanted to pretend our emotions weren't there, which only bred then the context for younger believers then expressing their emotions, but not knowing how to express them in healthy ways and in Christ-like ways, because they were never given an example of it. They were never taught anything about it, because they were basically, whether it was directly taught or it was caught, it was almost as if you shouldn't have any emotion at all, or any overt expression of emotion was bad. And so my greatest desire is that we would learn to, we've struggled to find a word, but harness our emotions well in our own personal lives towards those that we are closest with, friends, family, loved ones. But then through that, then learn how to express them in a Christ-like way out in public around people. Because I do believe there is a righteous anger that can be expressed publicly, like Jesus does, that would be that would be helpful for people around you. But you're not going to get there overnight. You going
No.
around and just wielding your anger everywhere isn't that, right? The formation of the Son of God himself
Right.
leading to the moment where he actually expresses anger in that way.
Yeah.
Y'all, it was at the very end of his ministry, and it was the only time we ever see him express it that way. This is the Son of God who had been formed in his own human body. We better believe we've got to be formed to a great degree in how to express our anger publicly before we go wielding it everywhere. But the beauty is, if God can do that in us, then the display of that will be a display of God himself for the world. And we praise people. This is what I'll leave off on. We praise people who have done that well, right?
Yeah.
We think about the nonviolent protests of believers that have gone before us, the ability for people, the anger is there, but the way they're expressing it beautifully displays the love of God for those around them. And even if the people in that moment don't realize it, we're able to then identify it now looking back.
Yeah.
And that's going to be one of the most key things you pass on to your kids, to people you disciple, to friends and family, is how to display emotion in a Christ-like way. And if we can do that well, I just think we'll change the game a lot on how the world views Christians and how we handle tense situations.
Yeah, I think that's going to be kind of next place where the church has to do some growing.
Yeah.
Remembering that these are gifts from God, our emotions are gifts, and they can be tools that help us to grow. They can be warning signs that help us to identify those places where God is trying to make us aware of something that we may not even know is present. And so I think that's one of the challenges, and one of the reasons we wanted to kind of just touch on this idea of emotions is because, especially today, in the last couple of decades, the church has kind of been giving up its ability to speak on this topic. And I think we're seeing some of the results of that failure to speak both biblically, but also clearly. I think that's the biggest thing for me, is that it has not been clear instruction on this. And so as we grow, as we mature, as we express these things, and we do it in safe ways with people that we trust and who know us, and then we learn how to do it publicly, I think people will begin to see that the church can speak into these areas of life. Again, it feels like it feels like it's almost silly, but Jesus lived a remarkably ordinary life. And in the pages of Scripture, we see the full range of his life expressed, including human emotion.
Exactly.
And so I want to encourage all of us to remember that your emotions are not your enemy. Your emotions are not your friend. Your emotions are there.
That's right.
They're there as a gift from God. And we need to learn to use them, be aware of them, and not lose sight that we need them. I think that's going to be my takeaway for tonight.
Awesome.
I use tonight because we're doing this in the evening. But anyways, guys, it has been a good conversation. We look forward to hearing from you.
Yeah.
We want this conversation to extend beyond just this podcast. You can connect with us on our many social platforms. We're on Locals, we're on Instagram, we're on Twitter, we're on YouTube, we're on Rumble. And those are the places that we're on Facebook. Those are the places you'll find us. But we would love to continue to extend this conversation with you. We'd love to hear your questions, your thoughts, your insights, your stories, anything that, if we said something that was like, they're dead wrong, let us know why. We would love to have a conversation. We are very real about that. We want to continue to have these conversations with you, because these are conversations that need to be had more often.
Agreed. Reach out.
And so we're so thankful.
For sure. Reach out. Talk to us about your experience with emotions, with your relationship with God, and how the church has handled them or sometimes mishandled them. So reach out, get a hold of us, let us know what you think, and continue these conversations with us. We thank you.
Thanks, guys.
You've been listening to Jesus Took Naps, a remarkably ordinary podcast. Make sure to like our Jesus Took Naps Facebook page and follow us on Instagram and Twitter at jesustooknaps.live. Also, go to our website, jesustooknaps.live, to sign up for our email newsletter for updates about the podcast. Thank you for joining us. Until next time.